Welcome to Mumblebee, where I mumble you into sleep with stories that drift like soft breezes through your mind. On this channel, my tales wander without direction, meandering through dreamy landscapes and carrying you gently away from the day's worries. So close your eyes, relax, and let me guide you into the land of dreams, where the journey is just as important as the destination. Before you drift off, please give this video a like as it really supports the channel. If these soothing stories help you relax, make sure to subscribe for more calming content. I'd also love to hear from you. Drop a comment with where you're from and what time you're tuning in. Sweet dreams. This is a special horror edition, The Hollow Whisper, Chapter 1, The Arrival. It was late evening when the bus rolled into Hollow Creek, a tiny, forgotten town nestled deep within the woods. Mia was the only passenger to step off, dragging her suitcase along the cracked pavement. The bus driver didn't wait. He shut the doors and drove off, as if eager to leave the place behind. The rumble of the engine faded quickly, swallowed by the oppressive silence that clung to the streets. Mia had been searching for work for months, and when she got the call about a housekeeping job at the town's only hotel, the Raven's Rest, she thought it was a stroke of luck. But now, standing alone in the darkened town square, she wasn't so sure. The air was thick, the kind of heavy silence that made it hard to breathe. Dim streetlights flickered overhead, casting strange, shifting shadows that stretched long across the cobblestone street. The hotel loomed before her, a grand old building that must have once been beautiful. Now it looked like a crumbling monument to a forgotten past. Ivy crept up the faded brick walls, and half of the windows were dark, as if the rooms beyond had been abandoned long ago. A single light glowed in the lobby, a weak yellow hue that barely pushed back the darkness. As Mia approached the entrance, she saw a figure standing in the doorway, a tall, thin man with a pale, expressionless face. He wore a black suit that looked several decades out of fashion, and his eyes, dark and unreadable, followed her as she stepped closer. She hesitated, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling, but there was nowhere else to go. "Welcome," he said, his voice low and cold, with no trace of warmth. "We've been expecting you." Mia's breath caught in her throat. "I'm here for the job interview," she managed to say, her voice barely steady. The man's lips curled into a thin smile, but his eyes remained cold and distant. "Of course you are. Follow me." He turned and disappeared into the dimly lit lobby, leaving Mia to follow in his shadow. She clutched her suitcase tightly, trying to ignore the sense of dread creeping up from her stomach. The lobby was spacious but eerily empty, the silence broken only by the faint creak of the wooden floorboards beneath her feet. An old chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals dulled by a layer of dust, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Mia could see a small brass bell on the front desk, the kind you'd ring for service. She felt a strange urge to reach out and press it, but as her hand moved closer, the man's voice cut through the stillness. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." He was standing behind the desk now, watching her with those cold, dark eyes. "You might wake them up." Mia's hand froze midair. "Wake who up?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a small metal key. "Your room is on the second floor," he said, handing her the key. "Room 207. I'll have your contract ready in the morning." Mia hesitated, glancing down at the key in her hand. "But I haven't had my interview yet." The man's smile widened, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Consider it done. You'll find your belongings already in the room." A shiver ran down Mia's spine. "I didn't send anything ahead." The man didn't respond. He just stared at her, his smile frozen in place, and for a moment, Mia thought she saw something flicker behind his eyes, something dark and restless, like a shadow stretching across a wall. She wanted to turn and run, to leave the hotel and the strange man behind, but her feet wouldn't move. As she reluctantly made her way up the creaking staircase, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The walls seemed to close in around her, the darkness pressing in from all sides. When she reached the second floor, she found a long, dimly lit hallway stretching out before her, lined with heavy wooden doors. She counted each one as she walked, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. 201, 203, 205, 207. Her room. She hesitated, staring at the brass numbers glinting in the faint light. Her hand trembled as she slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a small, tidy room with a single bed, a wooden dresser, and a window overlooking the darkened street below. It was simple but clean, and for a moment, Mia felt a brief sense of relief. Then she saw it, the contract, neatly laid out on the desk by the window. But it wasn't the contract that made her blood run cold. It was the signature at the bottom, written in elegant, flowing script. Her signature. She stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest, and looked at the name scrawled at the bottom of the page. It was her name, but she hadn't signed it. She would have remembered. Her hands began to shake as she picked up the pen beside the contract, feeling the weight of it between her fingers. The moment she touched the pen, the air in the room changed. It grew colder, heavier, as if something was pressing down on her. The lights flickered, and Mia glanced up, her breath hitching in her throat. She was no longer alone. Standing in the doorway was the shadowy, faceless figure she had seen in the mirror earlier, its dark shape barely visible in the dim light. It took a step forward, and the door slammed shut behind it. Mia's heart stopped as she stumbled back, clutching the contract against her chest, unable to look away from the dark figure. "Welcome back," it said, and Mia's blood froze. The voice wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from within her own head. She dropped the pen, and it clattered to the floor, echoing through the still room. The figure moved closer, its outline flickering, and for a moment, Mia thought she saw herself reflected in its dark, shifting surface. But it wasn't just a reflection. It was her, staring back at her from within the figure, her face twisted into a cruel, mocking smile. "No," she whispered, backing away. "This isn't real." The figure reached out, its shadowy hand stretching toward her, and the room seemed to tilt, the walls bending inward, the shadows swallowing the light. Mia felt her knees give out, and she fell back against the bed, the contract slipping from her hands. The last thing she saw before the darkness closed in was her own face, grinning at her from within the shadows. The same cold, empty smile she had seen on the man in the lobby. Chapter 2. The Guest. Mia awoke with a jolt, gasping for air. Her room was dark, the only light coming from a thin sliver of moonlight that crept through the gap in the curtains. For a moment, she thought she was still dreaming, that the shadowy figure would be there, waiting for her. But the room was empty, silent, except for the faint hum of the old radiator by the window. She glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It was 3 a.m. Her head throbbed, and she felt groggy, as if she had been sedated. Slowly, she sat up, trying to piece together the fragments of her memory. But everything was fuzzy. The contract, the dark figure, the whisper inside her head, it all felt like a nightmare. But there, crumpled on the floor beside the bed, was the contract, with her name scrawled at the bottom. Mia's heart raced as she picked it up, her hands trembling. She needed to get out of this place, to find someone who could explain what was happening. But as she stood up, a soft, muffled sound drifted through the wall, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone lightly knocking on a door. She froze, listening. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, then stopped. Mia crept to the door and pressed her ear against it, straining to hear. There was a moment of silence, and then a soft, shuffling sound, as if someone was moving down the hallway. Gathering her courage, Mia slowly opened the door and peered out into the corridor. The hallway was dimly lit, stretching out into darkness on either side. She could just make out a figure at the far end, standing with their back to her. It was a woman, her long, dark hair hanging loosely around her shoulders. She was facing a door, her head tilted slightly to the side, as if listening for something. "Hello?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman didn't react, didn't move. Mia took a hesitant step forward. "Are you okay?" The woman's head snapped around, and Mia's breath caught in her throat. The woman's face was pale, gaunt, with dark circles under her eyes, and her mouth was slightly open, as if she was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. She stared at Mia, unblinking, her eyes wide and hollow. And then, without warning, she turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner at the end of the hall. Mia hesitated, torn between running back into her room and following the woman. But something about the way she moved, the way she looked, it was like she was asking for help. Mia stepped out into the hallway, her footsteps soft and cautious as she made her way toward the corner. As she turned the corner, she saw the woman standing in front of another door, slightly ajar, her hand resting on the doorknob. She looked up, meeting Mia's eyes, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition, as if she had been waiting for Mia all along. "Please?" the woman whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "Help me." Mia felt a chill crawl down her spine. "What's wrong?" she asked, taking a step closer. "Do you need me to call someone?" The woman's eyes darted to the door, and she shook her head. "No, it's too late. They're already here." Before Mia could ask what she meant, the door creaked open, revealing a dark, empty room beyond. The woman stepped inside, and Mia hesitated, torn between the urge to follow her and the overwhelming sense of dread that was building in her chest. She took a deep breath and stepped into the room, the door closing softly behind her. The room was dark, the air cold and heavy. and as Mia's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw that it was sparsely furnished, with a single bed, a dresser, and a small nightstand. But what drew her attention was the mirror on the wall opposite the bed. It was large, ornate, with a thick gilded frame, and its surface was covered in a thin layer of dust. The woman was standing in front of the mirror, her back to Mia, staring at her own reflection. "They're here," she whispered again, her voice trembling. "They've been watching me, waiting." Mia took a step closer, her eyes fixed on the mirror. "Who's watching you?" she asked, but the woman didn't answer. Instead, she lifted her hand and slowly, carefully touched the surface of the mirror. The glass rippled, like water disturbed by a pebble, and Mia gasped, stumbling back. The woman's reflection began to change, distorting, her features twisting and stretching until they no longer resembled a human face. Her mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, stretching into a grotesque, silent scream. Mia tried to turn and run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on the mirror as the woman's reflection continued to change, her mouth stretching, until it split open. And from the darkness within, something began to crawl out. It was small at first, just a sliver of shadow, but it grew, expanding and writhing until it took shape. Long, thin limbs, a hunched back, and a head with no face, just a dark, empty void where the eyes should have been. It climbed out of the mirror, its limbs bending and snapping, and stood behind the woman, its head tilting to one side as it looked down at her. Mia's heart pounded, her mind screaming at her to run, but she was paralyzed, trapped by the horror unfolding before her. The woman turned, her eyes wide with terror, and for a moment Mia thought she was going to scream, but then she simply said, "They're here for you too." The shadow moved, its limbs stretching out, reaching for Mia, and the room plunged into darkness. Mia felt something cold and sharp brush against her skin, and then there was nothing, just silence and the faint rhythmic ticking of a clock. When the lights flickered back on, the room was empty. The woman was gone, the shadow was gone, and the mirror was perfectly still, its surface smooth and clear. But when Mia looked into the glass, she saw her own reflection staring back at her, and behind her, standing just over her shoulder, was the shadowy figure from her dream, its dark, featureless face inches from hers. Mia stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat, and when she looked again, the mirror was empty, reflecting only the room. She turned and ran, throwing open the door and stumbling out into the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't stop running until she was back in her room, slamming the door shut and locking it behind her. She leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath, but her mind was reeling, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was coming for her. She glanced down at her hands, and that's when she saw it. A thin, black thread wrapped tightly around her wrist, cutting into her skin. She tried to pull it off, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if it was part of her, stitched into her flesh. The lights flickered, and from the corner of her eye, she saw something move, a shadow, crawling across the floor, stretching toward her. Mia didn't dare look up. She closed her eyes, praying that when she opened them, it would all be gone. But even with her eyes closed, she could feel it there, hovering just out of sight, waiting. And somewhere, just beyond the walls, she heard it again. The faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone lightly knocking on a door. Chapter 3. The Receptionist. Mia didn't sleep. She lay on the bed, clutching the thin blanket, staring up at the ceiling as the hours crept by. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that dark, twisting shadow crawling out of the mirror, felt its cold, claw-like touch on her skin. She had never believed in ghosts or spirits, but whatever was happening in the Raven's Rest wasn't normal. She needed answers, and she needed them now. As dawn's faint light seeped through the curtains, Mia forced herself to get up. Her body ached, her head throbbed, and her wrist still stung where the black thread had wrapped around her. She looked down at it, hoping it would have disappeared by morning. But it was still there, tight and taut, as if someone had tied it to her. She dressed quickly, her hands shaking, and made her way downstairs. The lobby was quiet, the shadows long and dark, and the old chandelier above barely managed to cast any light. The front desk was empty, but as Mia approached, she saw a familiar figure, a young man, probably in his 20s, standing behind the desk, his back turned to her. He wore a black suit, much like the man she had seen the night before, but there was something off about him. He was perfectly still, not moving, not even breathing. "Excuse me," Mia said, her voice hoarse. "I need to talk to someone, right now." The man turned around slowly, and Mia's heart skipped a beat. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were dark, sunken pits, like he hadn't slept in weeks. But what struck her most was the lack of expression. His face was completely blank, devoid of any emotion. "Yes?" he said, his voice flat, monotone. "How may I assist you?" Mia took a step closer, her pulse quickening. Something happened last night. I saw someone in my room, and I think there was a woman on this floor." Before she could finish, the man slid a piece of paper across the desk. "Sign here," he said, cutting her off. Mia stared at the paper. "What is this?" "Room change," the receptionist replied. "For your safety." "My safety?" Mia's voice shook. "I don't understand." "You don't need to understand," the man said, his tone unchanging. "You just need to sign." Mia looked down at the paper. Her room number, 207, had been crossed out, replaced with a new one, 302. "No," she said, pushing the paper back. "I'm not signing anything until you tell me what's going on. Who was that woman? Why was there a shadow in my room?" The receptionist's eyes flickered, but his expression remained unchanged. "It's not safe in the East Wing," he said. "The others don't like visitors." Mia's hands began to shake. "The others?" she repeated. "Who are you talking about?" The receptionist didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, rusted key. He held it up, the metal catching the light, and for a moment Mia thought she saw a dark stain on his hand, like ink or dried blood. "This key will get you into room 103, he said. "That's where you'll find the answers you're looking for." Mia's throat tightened. "I don't want a different room," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to leave." The receptionist's lips twitched into a smile, but it was a smile that didn't belong on a human face. It was too wide, too sharp, and it made Mia's skin crawl. "You'll leave when they say you can leave," he said. "Until then, you're a guest, and guests don't leave without permission." Mia took a step back, her mind racing. She needed to get out of this place, but the door to the lobby was locked, and the receptionist was blocking the way. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the black thread tightening around her wrist, pulling, tugging, as if trying to lead her somewhere. "Where's the key?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "To the front door. I want to go home." The receptionist tilted his head, his dark eyes glinting. "Home?" he said, as if the word amused him. "There is no home. Only this place. Only us." Mia's hands were trembling now, but she refused to let herself fall apart. "Let me out," she said, her voice stronger this time. "Or I'll—" The receptionist's expression darkened, and he stepped forward, leaning across the desk until his face was inches from hers. "You'll what?" he whispered, his breath cold against her skin. "There's nothing out there for you. Nothing but shadows. If you leave, they'll follow you. Is that what you want?" Mia recoiled, but as she did, she noticed something. There was a small, black doll sitting on the desk beside the stack of papers, its button eyes staring blankly at her. It hadn't been there when she first arrived, and she had no idea where it had come from. But there it was, its tiny hands stitched together, its head tilted to the side as if listening. She felt her skin crawl as she reached out to touch it, but the moment her fingers brushed against the fabric, the doll's head snapped up, and its button eyes glowed, 2 tiny pinpricks of red light. Mia gasped, pulling her hand back, but the doll didn't move again. It just sat there, silent and still, its eyes dark and empty once more. "Room 103, the receptionist said, his voice echoing through the silence. "If you want to know the truth, that's where you'll find it." Mia looked up, her eyes wide with fear. The receptionist was staring at her, his face blank, but there was something in his eyes, something dark and hollow, like a void that threatened to swallow her whole. She didn't want to go to room 103, didn't want to know what was waiting for her there. But she knew, deep down, that she didn't have a choice. Slowly, she took the key from his hand, feeling its cold, rough surface against her palm. The receptionist stepped back, his expression unreadable, and Mia turned, walking slowly toward the hallway. As she did, she heard the faint rhythmic tapping again, coming from somewhere behind her, like someone lightly knocking on a door. She glanced back over her shoulder, but the receptionist was gone. The lobby was empty, and the only sound was the ticking of the old grandfather clock by the entrance, its pendulum swinging back and forth in a slow, steady rhythm. Mia's heart pounded as she made her way to the staircase, clutching the key tightly. She didn't know what she would find in room 103, but she had to keep moving. She had to understand what was happening, even if the truth was something she wasn't ready to face. As she reached the first floor, she saw the faint outline of the doll in the shadows, sitting on the bottom step, its button eyes gleaming. She could have sworn it was smiling. Chapter 4, Room 103. Mia's footsteps echoed in the dim, empty hallway as she approached room 103. The key felt heavy in her hand, and her pulse quickened with each step. The corridor was darker here, the lights dimming to a dull, sickly yellow, casting long shadows that flickered against the walls. It felt as if the hotel itself was holding its breath, waiting. When she reached the door, she hesitated. The number 103 was barely visible, the brass tarnished and scratched as if someone had tried to claw it off. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowy figure again, but the hallway was empty. With a deep breath, she inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow room. The air was musty, and a faint, metallic smell lingered, like rust or old blood. Mia hesitated, her hand still on the doorknob, but she forced herself to step inside. She flicked the light switch, and a single bare bulb flickered to life, casting a weak yellow glow over the room. It was small and cluttered, with stacks of old, dusty books piled high on a wooden table. Papers were scattered everywhere, some yellowed and curling at the edges, covered in notes and strange, illegible symbols. Against the far wall was an old, cracked mirror, its surface dull and smudged, reflecting the faint light back into the room. Mia's eyes were drawn to a large, leather-bound book lying open on the table, its pages covered in spidery handwriting. She stepped closer, peering at the text, but the words seemed to shift and blur, making it impossible to read. As she reached out to turn the page, she noticed a photograph tucked between the pages. It was an old, black and white photo, faded and creased. The image was of a group of people standing in front of the Raven's Rest, their faces expressionless. Mia recognized the building immediately, but the people, something was off. She squinted, bringing the photo closer to the light, and felt a chill run down her spine. One of the people in the photo was her. She dropped the photo, stumbling back. That was impossible. She had never been to Hollow Creek before yesterday. She bent down to pick it up, her hands shaking. And that's when she noticed it, a small black thread sticking out of the spine of the book, like the one wrapped around her wrist. She tugged at it, and the thread slid out easily, unraveling as it came loose. The room went silent, as if the air had been sucked out, and Mia felt a sharp, sudden pain in her wrist. She looked down and saw the black thread tightening, cutting into her skin. She yanked at it, trying to pull it off, but it only tightened more, digging deeper until her skin bled. The light flickered, and Mia heard a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on the wall. She turned, her heart pounding, and saw the old mirror against the wall. Its surface was rippling, like water disturbed by a breeze. Mia's reflection stared back at her, but there was something wrong. Her reflection was smiling, a slow, sinister smile that didn't belong on her face. "Stop it," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't real." The reflection's smile widened, and it raised its hand, pressing it against the glass. Slowly, the hand began to push through, the surface of the mirror stretching and bending as if it were made of liquid. Mia backed away, but she couldn't take her eyes off the mirror, off the thing that was crawling out. A dark, slender hand emerged first, followed by an arm, its skin pale and smooth, like polished porcelain. Mia watched, frozen in place, as the figure climbed out of the mirror, unfolding itself into the room. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned black dress, her hair long and dark, falling over her shoulders. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and empty, and when she looked at Mia, she smiled, the same cold, unnerving smile that Mia had seen in her reflection. Mia wanted to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The black thread around her wrist tightened, pulling her closer to the woman, dragging her forward. The woman reached out, her hand cold and clammy, and touched Mia's cheek. "Welcome back," she whispered, her voice soft and melodic, but there was an edge to it, something sharp and sinister. "We've missed you." Mia shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know you." The woman's smile faded, and her eyes darkened. "But we know you, Mia," she said. "We've always known you." Mia felt the room spinning, the walls closing in, and she stumbled back, hitting the edge of the table. The books and papers slid to the floor, scattering across the room, and she saw something glinting among the mess. A small silver key hidden beneath the pages. Without thinking, she grabbed it, clutching it tightly in her hand. The woman's eyes flicked to the key, and for the first time, her expression changed. Fear, pure, unfiltered fear. She stepped back, her movements jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. "Give it to me," she said, her voice low, trembling. "It doesn't belong to you." Mia shook her head, her grip tightening around the key. "No," she said, her voice stronger this time. "You can't have it." The woman's smile returned, but it was strained, forced. "You don't understand what you're holding," she said, her eyes darting to the mirror. "It will destroy everything." The black thread around Mia's wrist loosened, and she felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to run, to get as far away from that room as possible. She turned and sprinted for the door, the key still clutched in her hand. As she reached the hallway, she glanced back and saw the woman standing in the doorway, her dark, empty eyes staring at her, unblinking. "Run, little girl," the woman whispered, her voice echoing through the hallway. "Run as fast as you can, but you'll never escape. We'll always find you." Mia didn't stop running until she was back in the lobby, her chest heaving, her skin cold and clammy. The chandelier above flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows across the room, and the clock on the wall ticked slowly, its pendulum swinging back and forth. She looked down at the key in her hand, the metal cold against her skin, and for a moment she thought she saw a face reflected in the silver, a familiar face, one she had seen before but couldn't quite place. She blinked, and the reflection was gone. From somewhere deep within the hotel, she heard the faint, rhythmic tapping again, and she realized it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside her own head. Chapter 5, Key to Nowhere. Mia's legs felt like they could barely support her as she stumbled into the lobby, clutching the silver key tightly. She had no idea what it unlocked, but she knew she wasn't safe. Not here, not anywhere. The faint, rhythmic tapping continued in her head, like a drumbeat that wouldn't stop, and she could feel it reverberating through her entire body, setting her nerves on edge. She tried to catch her breath, glancing around the lobby for any sign of the receptionist, the woman, or anything else that could explain what was happening. But the space was empty, eerily still, and the only sound was the slow, steady ticking of the old grandfather clock. It was a maddeningly calm contrast to the chaos that was building inside her. As she approached the front desk, hoping to find a phone or some way to call for help, she saw something that made her stomach drop. The black doll was back, sitting neatly on the desk, its button eyes staring directly at her. It hadn't been there a moment ago. She was sure of it. Yet there it was, positioned like it was waiting, its tiny head tilted as if it was listening. Mia took a step back, her skin crawling. She didn't want to get closer, but she needed answers. The The silver key was still cold in her hand, its weight growing heavier, and she felt compelled to find out what had opened. She reached out, hesitating for just a moment, then picked up the doll. The fabric felt rough and cold, and for a split second, she thought she felt it twitch. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, but she wasn't expecting a response. The doll was silent, motionless, but something about its presence made the tapping in her head grow louder, more insistent. Mia tightened her grip on the key, glancing around the lobby for any hint of where it might belong. Her eyes darted to the staircase that led to the basement, its entrance barely visible behind a curtain of shadows. She hadn't been down there yet, hadn't even thought about it. But now, as if the hotel itself was guiding her, she felt a pull, an almost magnetic force urging her to descend those dark, narrow stairs. It didn't make sense. Nothing did. But she couldn't ignore the feeling that whatever was happening here, the answers were waiting for her below. With a deep breath, Mia stepped toward the staircase, the tapping in her head growing louder with each step. She could feel her pulse quicken, her heartbeat syncing with the rhythmic drumming, and it took everything she had not to turn and run. She descended slowly, the stairs creaking under her weight, the air growing colder and thicker the further she went down. At the bottom, she found herself standing in a narrow hallway, dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with old, peeling wallpaper, and the air smelled damp, like mildew and rot. There were doors on either side of the hall, most of them closed, but one at the very end was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out from the gap. Mia approached it cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the confined space. As she got closer, she could hear faint voices coming from inside, murmurs, almost like chanting, though she couldn't make out any of the words. She reached out to push the door open, but before she could touch it, the door creaked and slowly swung inward on its own. The room beyond was small, cramped, and filled with odd, mismatched furniture. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with jars of murky liquid, stacks of yellowed papers, and various trinkets that looked like they had been gathered from 1,000 different places. But what drew Mia's attention was the figure seated at the far end of the room, hunched over a table, its back turned to her. The figure was wearing a long, dark coat, its head bowed as it scribbled something on a piece of parchment. The silver key in Mia's hand pulsed, almost vibrating, as if it recognized the figure, but she had never seen this person before. She stepped inside, swallowing her fear, and the figure slowly turned its head to look at her. Mia gasped. It was the receptionist, but not as she had seen him before. His face was twisted, gaunt, his skin pale and stretched thin over his bones. His eyes, once dark and empty, now glowed a faint, sickly yellow. And when he smiled, it was a slow, deliberate movement that showed far too many teeth. "Found the key, did you?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Good. You've come further than the others." Mia's grip tightened around the key. "What is this place?" she demanded. "What are you?" The receptionist tilted his head, as if considering her question. "This place is a door," he said. "A doorway to things better left unseen. And I am just the one who keeps it open." Mia's mind raced, trying to make sense of his words. "I want to leave," she said, her voice shaking. "I want to go home." The receptionist's smile widened. "Home?" he echoed, the word twisting in his mouth like a curse. "You are home, Mia. You've always been here." "No, that's not true," she said, taking a step back. "I don't belong here." The tapping in her head grew louder, pounding against her skull, and she could feel the black thread around her wrist tightening again, pulling, constricting. She wanted to scream, to tear it off, but she knew it wouldn't help. The receptionist's eyes glinted as he watched her struggle, and he leaned forward, his smile never faltering. "You hold the key," he said softly. "But do you know what it unlocks?" Mia looked down at the key, her hands trembling. She didn't know, but she could feel it. Whatever the key opened, it was something terrible, something that should never be found. She glanced back at the receptionist, but he was no longer watching her. His gaze had shifted to the wall behind her, where the shadowy outline of a door was beginning to appear, its edges dark and jagged, like a wound torn in the fabric of reality. The tapping was deafening now, a relentless, rhythmic beat that matched her own heartbeat. Mia turned, her eyes wide, as the shadowy door crept closer, stretching out toward her. The black thread around her wrist pulsed, and she felt herself being pulled, dragged toward the door, even as she tried to resist. She stumbled forward, her hands outstretched, and the silver key slipped from her fingers, falling to the floor with a sharp, metallic clink. For a moment, everything went silent. The tapping stopped, the shadows stilled, and Mia could hear only the sound of her own breathing, ragged and desperate. Then the receptionist spoke, his voice low and triumphant. "You wanted to leave," he said, almost laughing. "But there is no escape. There never was." Mia looked down at the key, lying motionless at her feet, and for a moment, she felt a strange sense of calm. She reached down, picked it up, and turned to face the shadowy door. The black thread tugged at her wrist, but she ignored it, focusing only on the key in her hand. Without thinking, she stepped forward, raising the key, and slid it into the lock. The door shuddered, the shadows writhing and twisting, and for a brief moment, Mia thought she saw faces in the darkness. Pale, hollow-eyed faces, staring at her, pleading silently. She hesitated, her hand trembling on the key. But then she turned it, and the lock clicked open. The door swung inward, revealing a yawning void beyond, a dark, endless chasm that seemed to swallow all light, all sound. Mia stepped closer, peering into the darkness, and felt the black thread around her wrist snap, unraveling until it was nothing but a faint, frayed line. She turned to look back at the receptionist, but he was gone. The room was empty, the walls bare, as if he had never been there at all. And then, slowly, she stepped through the door, letting the darkness close around her, letting it take her. Somewhere in the distance, the tapping began again, slow and rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock. Chapter 6, Voices in the Dark. The darkness swallowed Mia whole. It was not just the absence of light, but a thick, suffocating blackness that seemed to seep into her skin, wrapping around her, pressing against her lungs. For a moment, she thought she was falling, tumbling through a vast, endless void. But then she felt something solid beneath her feet, cold, hard stone. She took a step forward, but her legs felt heavy, as if something was holding them back. Her eyes strained to see, but there was nothing. No light, no shapes, only the dark. And then Softly at first, she heard them. Voices, faint and distant, like whispers carried on the wind. Mia's heart pounded in her chest, and she spun around, trying to pinpoint where the sounds were coming from, but they seemed to come from everywhere, echoing around her, layering over each other until they formed a chorus of murmurs. She could make out a few words, fragments of sentences that made no sense, yet carried a strange, haunting familiarity. Come back. Don't forget. Remember who you are. The words sent a chill down her spine. She didn't recognize the voices, but she knew they were speaking to her. Or perhaps they were speaking through her, echoing in her mind like forgotten memories. The darkness pressed in closer, and she felt a cold, clammy hand brush against her arm. She gasped, pulling away, but there was nothing there. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Mia stumbled forward, her hands outstretched, trying to find something, anything, that would lead her out of this nightmare. Her fingers brushed against cold stone walls, slick with moisture, and she realized she was in a narrow passageway, winding and twisting, leading her deeper into the dark. With each step, the voices changed, growing sharper, harsher, as if they were angry. She heard laughter, cruel and mocking, and the faint sound of something scraping against the walls, like nails dragging across the stone. The passageway twisted and turned, and she followed it blindly, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She turned a corner, and suddenly, the darkness wasn't quite so thick. A faint, sickly green light flickered at the end of the corridor, pulsing weakly like a dying heartbeat. Mia's legs trembled, but she forced herself to move forward, drawn to the light, even though every instinct screamed at her to turn back. The passage opened up into a small, circular chamber, and in the center of the room stood a low stone table. The green light emanated from a lantern that hung from the ceiling, casting a sickly glow over the scene. But what made Mia's breath catch in her throat was what lay on the table, a black tattered cloak, spread out as if waiting for someone to wear it. The cloak looked ancient, frayed at the edges, and as she stepped closer, she could see strange, intricate symbols stitched into the fabric, glowing faintly in the green light. Her head pounded, the rhythmic tapping growing louder, more urgent, as if it was trying to force its way into her skull. She clutched the sides of her head, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. The whispers returned, louder this time, and she could make out individual voices. One that was deep and raspy, another that was soft, almost childlike. They were speaking in unison, chanting the same phrase over and over again. Wear it, wear it, wear it. Mia backed away, shaking her head, but the voices grew louder, their chant rising to a deafening roar. The cloak seemed to twitch, the fabric rippling as if something inside it was trying to get out. "Stop it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the din. "Please, stop." The chanting continued, relentless, and the green light flickered wildly, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. One of the shadows moved, detaching itself from the wall, and Mia's heart nearly stopped when she saw it. It was a figure, tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its face hidden beneath a hood. It moved slowly, silently, gliding across the room until it stood beside the table, its head bowed as if in prayer. The whispers fell silent, and for a moment, the room was eerily still. Then the figure raised its head, and Mia saw its face. pale, almost translucent, with eyes that were too large, too dark, as if they had been hollowed out. The corners of its mouth curled into a twisted, unnatural smile, and it spoke in a voice that was not quite human. "We have been waiting for you, Mia." Mia's knees buckled, and she had to steady herself against the wall. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, the smile never leaving its face. "We want you to remember," it said. "You are one of us. You have always been one of us." "No," Mia said, shaking her head. "I don't understand. I don't belong here." The figure stepped closer, and Mia could see the shadows swirling beneath its cloak, writhing and twisting like dark tendrils. "You opened the door," it said, its voice low and melodic, almost soothing. "You let us in. Now you must wear the cloak." Mia looked down at the cloak, her heart pounding. The symbols stitched into the fabric seemed to pulse, glowing brighter, and she could feel the thread around her wrist tightening again, pulling her closer to the table. The figure reached out, its hand cold and skeletal, and lifted the cloak, holding it out to her. "Wear it," the figure said, "or let the darkness consume you." The green light flickered, and for a brief moment Mia thought she saw faces in the shadows, faces she recognized, twisted and contorted in agony. Her own face was among them, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I won't." The figure's smile faded, and its eyes darkened, filling with something that looked like pity. "You have no choice," it said softly. "The cloak is yours. It has always been yours." Mia's hands shook as she reached out, her fingers brushing against the fabric. It felt cold, like ice, and as she lifted it, she could feel the symbols burning into her skin, searing her flesh. She wanted to drop it, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. Slowly, almost mechanically, she draped the cloak over her shoulders, and the moment it settled around her, she felt a strange, suffocating weight, as if the shadows themselves were pressing down on her. The room went dark, the green light snuffed out, and Mia felt herself falling, tumbling into the void. The voices returned, louder than ever, their chanting echoing in her ears, filling her head until she thought it would burst. She clawed at the cloak, trying to tear it off, but the fabric clung to her, tightening around her throat, her chest, squeezing the breath from her lungs. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chanting stopped. The darkness lifted, and Mia found herself standing in the middle of the room, the cloak hanging loosely around her shoulders. The green light had returned, flickering weakly, and the figure was gone, leaving her alone. Mia looked down at her hands, expecting to see burns, but her skin was smooth, unmarked. She reached up, pulling the cloak tighter around her, and felt something cold and metallic in the pocket. She hesitated, then reached in and pulled out a small silver key, identical to the one she had used to open the door. As she turned the key over in her hand, she heard it again, the faint, rhythmic tapping, growing louder, closer, as if something was moving through the walls, coming straight for her. Mia's eyes darted around the room, but there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and she realized, with a sickening sense of dread, that it was not coming from the walls. It was coming from inside her own head. Chapter 7. The red room. The tapping in Mia's head was relentless, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to synchronize with her heartbeat. She clutched the silver key tightly, the cold metal biting into her palm, but it did nothing to quiet the noise. The room around her felt smaller, the walls pressing in, suffocating her. She had to get out, had to escape this suffocating, endless darkness. With a shaky breath, she stumbled back into the hallway. The dim, flickering light from the single bulb did little to chase away the shadows that seemed to stretch and curl along the walls, moving almost like they had a life of their own. As she looked down the narrow passage, she noticed something strange. There was another door, one she hadn't seen before, at the far end of the hall. It was different from the others, painted a deep blood red that stood out starkly against the faded wallpaper. There was no number on it, no indication of where it led, but something about it drew Mia in. The tapping grew louder as she moved closer, echoing through her skull, as if encouraging her to open the door. She reached for the handle, but hesitated, her fingers hovering just above the cold metal. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to run, but she couldn't. It was as if the door was calling to her, whispering her name, luring her forward. Slowly, she turned the handle and pushed the door open. The hinges creaked, and she stepped inside, her breath catching as she took in the room before her. It was large, much larger than she expected, and bathed in an eerie crimson light. The walls were lined with mirrors, stretching from floor to ceiling, each one slightly warped, distorting the reflections. Mia could see herself, dozens of versions of herself, staring back at her, but none of them looked quite right. Some had hollow, dark eyes, others twisted, distorted smiles that stretched too wide. At the center of the room was a single chair, and in it sat a man. He was slumped over, his head bowed, and his hands were bound tightly to the armrests with the same black thread that had been wrapped around her wrist. His clothes were tattered, and his skin was pale, almost gray, as if he had been there for a long time. Mia's heart raced as she stepped closer, the rhythmic tapping pounding louder, louder, until it was deafening. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling, but the man didn't respond. She could see his chest rising and falling, slow and shallow, but he remained motionless, his head hanging low. She reached out, gently touching his shoulder, and he jerked upright, gasping for breath. His head snapped up, and Mia stumbled back, her eyes widening in horror. His face was gaunt, his cheeks sunken, and his eyes were wide, bloodshot, filled with terror. But what terrified her most was that she recognized him. It was the bus driver. He stared at her, his lips trembling, as if trying to form words. But all that came out was a strangled, rasping sound. Mia stepped back, her mind reeling. "What? What are you doing here?" she stammered. "How did you get—" Before she could finish, the mirrors around the room flickered, and Mia saw movement in the reflections. Shadows, dark and twisting, slithered across the glass, darting from mirror to mirror, circling the room. She spun around, trying to follow them, but they moved too fast, disappearing just as she thought she could catch a glimpse. The bus driver's eyes widened, and he began to thrash against his restraints, his voice hoarse and desperate. "They're coming," he choked out, his words barely audible. "You have to. Get out. Before they—" The crimson light dimmed, and for a moment, the room plunged into darkness. Mia's breath hitched, and she could feel the air grow colder, thicker, as if something was moving through it, closing in around her. She turned back to the bus driver, but he was no longer struggling. His head had fallen forward again, his eyes glassy, lifeless. Mia's pulse pounded in her ears, and she stepped back, bumping into one of the mirrors. The glass was cool against her skin, and she turned to see her reflection staring back at her. But it wasn't her. The face in the mirror was twisted, distorted, with dark, empty sockets where the eyes should have been. It smiled, a slow, creeping grin that spread across its face, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. "No," Mia whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." The reflection's mouth moved, but the words didn't match. "It is very real, Mia, and it's just beginning." She stumbled away from the mirror, her hands shaking, and the other reflections began to change, twisting into grotesque, nightmarish versions of herself. Each one was worse than the last. Some had blood dripping from their eyes. Others had mouths stretched impossibly wide, as if screaming silently. And they were all smiling, the same cold, sinister smile. Mia turned back to the bus driver, desperate for answers, but his body had slumped over, limp and still. The black threads around his wrists had loosened, falling away, and she saw something glinting on the floor beneath his chair. A key, small and silver, identical to the one she had been carrying. She hesitated, then reached down and picked it up, her fingers trembling. As soon as she touched the key, the crimson light brightened, flooding the room, and the mirrors began to crack, spiderweb fractures spreading across the glass. The tapping in her head grew louder, more frantic, as if trying to drown out everything else, and she could feel it vibrating through her entire body. Then she heard the whisper again, faint but clear, cutting through the noise. "Run!" Mia didn't need to be told twice. She turned and ran, the red room blurring around her as she sprinted for the door. The mirrors shattered, shards of glass raining down, but she didn't stop, didn't look back. She burst out into the hallway, gasping for breath, the silver key clutched tightly in her hand. The rhythmic tapping followed her, echoing through the halls, relentless and rhythmic, and she could hear faint whispers, growing louder, closer, as if chasing her. She stumbled down the corridor, the shadows stretching and twisting, blocking her path, but she kept moving, her legs burning, her chest tight. She had to get out. She had to. Mia skidded to a stop, her heart freezing as she saw the door at the end of the hall. It was red, just like the one she had just left, but this one had no handle, no keyhole. It was smooth, featureless, yet she could feel something on the other side, pressing against it, trying to push through. The shadows around her writhed, slithering along the walls, and she could hear them whispering, their voices merging into a single, haunting chant. "Let us in, Mia! Let us in!" The red door trembled, the surface rippling, and Mia took a step back, the silver key slipping from her grasp. As it hit the floor, the tapping stopped, replaced by a low guttural growl that echoed through the hall. The door began to bulge outward, the smooth surface distorting, as if something was trying to force its way through. Mia's mind screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her eyes fixed on the door, and she could feel it. Something dark, something hungry, waiting just beyond. ready to tear through and swallow her whole. And then, slowly, the door began to open, just a crack, enough to let a sliver of darkness seep out, coiling around her feet, cold and suffocating. Mia's breath hitched, and she could hear it whispering to her, its voice soft, soothing, almost kind. "We've been waiting for you, Mia. Come back to us." The red door creaked open wider, and she saw them, dark, hollow eyes peering through the gap, dozens of them, staring at her, unblinking. The shadows crept closer, curling around her legs, her arms, pulling her toward the door, and she could feel them, cold and sharp, like claws digging into her skin. Mia tried to scream, but no sound came out. The red door yawned open, wider and wider, until all she could see was darkness, endless and consuming. And the last thing she heard before it swallowed her was a faint, rhythmic tapping, like a heartbeat, fading into silence. Chapter 8. Whispers Beneath the Floorboards. Mia awoke with a start, her body jerking as if pulled from a terrible dream. She was lying on the cold, hard floor of what seemed to be a different room, the air thick and musty. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she had gotten there. The events of the red room felt hazy, like a nightmare that had slipped away the moment she opened her eyes. She sat up slowly, blinking against the darkness. There was no light, only a dim, suffocating gloom that pressed in from all sides. Her head throbbed, and when she reached up to touch her temple, she felt something wet and sticky. Blood. She must have hit her head, but she couldn't remember when or how. The room around her was silent, unnaturally so, but she could sense movement just beyond the edge of her vision. Something was there, watching her, waiting. She forced herself to stand, her legs shaky, and as she did, she heard it again. The faint, rhythmic tapping, echoing from somewhere below. Mia's pulse quickened. She didn't want to hear it, didn't want to acknowledge it, but the sound was insistent, burrowing into her mind. She took a step forward, and the floor creaked beneath her, the boards groaning as if protesting her presence. The tapping grew louder, clearer, and she realized it wasn't just a noise. It was a signal, a message, calling her closer. She began to move, letting the tapping guide her through the dark. Her hands skimmed along the walls, feeling the rough, splintered wood beneath her fingers. The hallway was narrow, twisting, and it felt like it was leading her deeper underground, further away from the world above. The air grew colder, the smell of damp earth filling her nose, and she shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. The corridor opened up into a small, cramped space, a cellar, or maybe an old storage room. The walls were lined with shelves, cluttered with dusty bottles and rusted metal tools, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of dirt. In the center of the room was a trapdoor, partially hidden beneath a ragged, moth-eaten rug. The rhythmic tapping was coming from below, louder now, almost deafening, as if something was pounding on the underside of the floor. Mia hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she shouldn't, knew she needed to turn around and leave this place behind, but she couldn't. The tapping had a hold on her, pulling her closer, and she felt her hands move almost of their own accord, lifting the edge of the rug to reveal the trapdoor. The wood was old, cracked, and there was no lock, only a rusted metal ring. She gripped it, her fingers slick with sweat, and pulled. The trapdoor creaked open, and a rush of cold, damp air escaped from the dark space below. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, muffled whispering that drifted up from the hole like the murmur of 1,000 voices speaking at once. Mia leaned forward, peering into the darkness, but she couldn't see anything. Only shadows, thick and impenetrable. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and she could make out individual words now, though they made no sense. She knows. Don't let her. Bring her down. The floor beneath her creaked again, and she could feel something shifting below, like a ripple passing through the earth. She pulled back, her heart hammering, but the whispers followed her, growing more insistent, more desperate. Bring her down, down, down. She didn't want to go down there. She knew that whatever was below the trapdoor was something she wasn't supposed to see, something that should have stayed hidden. But she couldn't ignore the pull, the way the voices seemed to reach out and wrap around her, dragging her closer. With a deep breath, she lowered herself through the opening, her feet finding a narrow, rickety ladder that led down into the dark. The air was colder, almost icy, and she could feel it seeping into her skin, chilling her to the bone. She climbed down slowly, each step creaking beneath her weight, until her feet touched solid ground. She was in a tunnel, the walls, rough and uneven, dug out of the earth. The whispers echoed around her, bouncing off the walls, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. She took a step forward, and the sound of her footfall seemed to trigger something, because the voices grew louder, a frantic, jumbled mess of words and phrases. She's here. She shouldn't be here. Don't let her see. Mia's breath hitched, and she stumbled forward, following the tunnel as it twisted and turned, leading her deeper underground. The walls seemed to close in around her, pressing against her, and she had to fight to keep moving, her hands scraping against the dirt. The tunnel opened up into a cavern, wide and dark, the ceiling so high she couldn't see it. At the center of the cavern was a pit, a yawning chasm that seemed to stretch endlessly downward, and from the depths, she could hear the whispers louder than ever, rising up in a frantic, discordant chorus. She stepped closer, peering into the pit, and for a moment, she thought she could see something moving down there, something shifting and writhing in the shadows. She squinted, trying to make it out, but the darkness was too thick, too complete. And then, without warning, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, suffocating, and she could hear nothing but the sound of her own breathing, ragged and shallow. She took a step back, her pulse pounding in her ears. But before she could turn away, a single voice spoke, cutting through the silence. Mia. She froze, her blood running cold. The voice was familiar, achingly so, but she couldn't place it. It sounded like her own, but distorted, twisted, as if it were coming from a great distance. She took another step back, and the floor beneath her shifted, almost like it was breathing. Mia, come closer. She didn't want to, but she couldn't stop herself. Her feet moved of their own accord, carrying her closer to the edge of the pit. And as she looked down, she saw something rise up from the darkness. It was a hand, pale and skeletal, reaching out from the depths, and behind it, she could see a face, her face, grinning up at her, its eyes wide and hollow, its mouth twisted into a grotesque, mocking smile. No, she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." The hand reached for her, its fingers curling around her ankle, and she could feel its touch, cold and clammy, sending a jolt of terror through her. She tried to pull away, but the grip tightened, dragging her closer to the edge. "Come down, Mia," the voice said, its tone sweet, almost gentle. "Come down and see what you've been hiding from." Mia struggled, but the hand was too strong, and she could feel herself slipping, her feet sliding closer to the edge of the pit. She looked down, and the face below grinned wider, its eyes glinting with something dark and hungry. "You can't escape us," it whispered. "You've never escaped. You've always been here." With a final, desperate effort, Mia kicked at the hand, breaking its grip, and stumbled back. The voice echoed up from the pit, rising into a howl of rage, and she turned and ran, her heart pounding, the walls of the tunnel closing in around her as she fled. She didn't stop until she was back at the ladder, scrambling up it, her hands slick with sweat and blood. She pulled herself through the trap door, slamming it shut behind her, and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. But the whispers hadn't stopped. They were still there, just beneath the surface, murmuring, waiting, and she could feel them, crawling beneath her skin, burrowing deeper into her mind. And from somewhere deep within the earth, she heard the tapping start again, slow and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Chapter 9, The Unseen Door. Mia lay on the floor, gasping for air, her mind spinning. The whispers had faded, but she could still feel their presence, lurking just beneath the surface, like a dark current threatening to pull her under. The rhythmic tapping had started again, echoing faintly, and she could feel it reverberate through her bones, growing stronger, more insistent. She pushed herself up, her arms trembling, and glanced around the room. It was the same cellar she'd entered before, but now something felt different. The shadows were deeper, darker, and the air was colder, laced with the damp, earthy scent of the underground. The trapdoor was still there, but she had no intention of opening it again. She just wanted to get out of this room, out of this hotel, out of Hollow Creek. But as she turned to leave, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. There was another door on the far side of the room, partially hidden behind a stack of dusty crates. It was small and nondescript, blending into the wall as if it didn't want to be seen. The tapping seemed to be coming from behind it, and as she moved closer, she could see that the door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness visible through the gap. Mia hesitated, every nerve in her body screaming at her to stay away, but she couldn't. The rhythmic tapping had a hold on her, compelling her forward, drawing her closer. She reached out, her hand shaking, and pushed the door open. It creaked, revealing a narrow, dimly lit staircase that descended into the dark. The steps were uneven, the wood warped and splintered, and the air that drifted up from below was thick and suffocating, carrying a faint, metallic smell that made her stomach churn. Mia hesitated, gripping the doorframe, but she could already hear the whispers beginning to rise, softly at first, then louder, urging her to move forward. She took a step onto the staircase, and the floorboards groaned beneath her weight. The tapping grew louder, echoing up from the depths below, and with each step she took, it felt like she was sinking deeper into the dark, like the staircase was swallowing her whole. The light from the room above grew dimmer, fainter, until it was just a distant glimmer, and then it vanished altogether, leaving her in total darkness. Mia reached out, running her fingers along the wall to steady herself, and felt something cold and wet, damp stone, slick with moisture. The tapping continued, slow and rhythmic, and she could hear whispers rising and falling, echoing through the dark like a chant. She couldn't understand the words, but the sound sent chills down her spine, filling her with a sense of dread she couldn't shake. At the bottom of the staircase, she found herself in a long, narrow corridor, the walls lined with old, rusted pipes that hissed and dripped. The floor was uneven, sloping downward, and the air was colder, thick with a damp, earthy smell that made it hard to breathe. Mia moved slowly, her footsteps echoing through the silence, and as she walked, she saw that the walls were covered in strange, crude carvings, symbols and figures etched into the stone, their meanings lost to time. The corridor twisted and turned, leading her deeper underground, and the further she went, the louder the tapping grew, until it was all she could hear, pounding in her head like a drumbeat. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more frantic, as if trying to warn her, but she couldn't turn back. She had to know what was down there, what was calling to her. The corridor opened up into a vast, dark chamber, and Mia stopped at the entrance, her breath catching in her throat. The room was massive, the ceiling lost in the shadows above, and at the center was a large circular platform, raised slightly off the ground. The platform was surrounded by rows of old wooden chairs, arranged in a perfect circle, each one facing inward, as if they were waiting for an audience. The tapping was louder here, almost deafening, and Mia could see where it was coming from. At the center of the platform was a large wooden table, and on it lay a small, ornate box. The lid was slightly open, and something inside was tapping against it, slow and deliberate, like a heartbeat. Mia stepped forward, her legs shaking, and as she approached the platform, she saw that the box was covered in intricate carvings, the same symbols she had seen on the walls. The wood was dark, almost black, and the carvings seemed to twist and writhe, as if they were alive. She reached out, her hand trembling, and lifted the lid. Inside the box was a small, black key, identical to the one she had found in the red room. The key was tapping against the inside of the box, as if trying to escape, and as soon as Mia touched it, the tapping stopped. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the chamber, and she could feel the air grow colder, pressing against her, suffocating her. She lifted the key out of the box, and as she did, the room fell silent. The tapping, the whispers, everything gone, replaced by a deep, echoing stillness. For a moment, she thought she was alone, but then she felt it. A presence, dark and heavy, watching her from the shadows. Mia turned slowly, and her heart nearly stopped when she saw them. Figures, standing in the darkness at the edge of the chamber, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. There were dozens of them, maybe more, all dressed in dark, tattered clothing, their faces hidden beneath heavy hoods. They were completely still, but she could feel their eyes on her, following her every move. One of the figures stepped forward, and Mia's breath caught in her throat. It was the woman from the mirror, her face pale and hollow, her eyes dark and empty. She moved slowly, gracefully, as if gliding across the floor, and when she spoke, her voice was soft, almost tender. "You found it," she said, her eyes fixed on the key in Mia's hand. The last key, Mia took a step back, clutching the key tightly. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" The woman smiled, but it was a sad, broken smile, as if she was trying to comfort a child who didn't understand. "This is where it begins," she said, "and where it ends. We are the keepers of the keys, and you have brought the final piece." Mia shook her head, her mind reeling. "I don't understand. I just want to leave." The woman's eyes softened, and she took another step forward. "There is no leaving, Mia," she said gently. "There never was. You are one of us. You have always been one of us." "No," Mia whispered, shaking her head. "That's not true." The woman reached out, her hand hovering just above Mia's, and for a moment she thought she could feel warmth, like a gentle touch. "We have been waiting for you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Waiting for you to remember." Mia's mind raced, trying to make sense of the woman's words, but nothing was clear. She looked down at the key, and as she did, she felt something stir inside her, something dark, something she didn't want to remember. She clenched her fist, fighting the urge to drop the key, but the woman's eyes were kind, pleading. "Please," the woman said softly, "it's time." Mia took a step back, her hands shaking, and the shadows around the chamber seemed to shift, closing in around her. The figures began to move, stepping forward, their eyes glowing brighter, and she could hear the whispers returning, rising into a chant. "Bring her home. Bring her home." Mia's heart pounded, and she turned, running back toward the corridor, but the shadows were everywhere, stretching out, blocking her path. She stumbled, falling to her knees, and as she looked up, she saw the woman standing over her, her face sad, almost mournful. "You can't run, Mia," she said softly. "You can't escape yourself." Mia felt a wave of cold wash over her, and for a moment, she thought she could see something. Flashes of images, memories, flickering at the edge of her vision. A dark room, a mirror, a face staring back at her, twisted and broken, and behind it, a shadow, smiling. She tried to push the images away, but they grew stronger, clearer, and she could feel the darkness creeping in, wrapping around her, pulling her down. The last thing she saw was the woman's face, pale and sorrowful, her eyes filled with something that looked almost like pity. "Welcome home," the woman whispered, and then the darkness swallowed her. Chapter 10. Reflections of the Past. Darkness wrapped around Mia, suffocating and cold. She drifted in it, lost, unable to tell how much time had passed. She couldn't see, couldn't move, couldn't even feel her own body. The only thing she could hear was a faint, rhythmic tapping, echoing somewhere far off, growing louder, then softer, like a heartbeat pulsing through the dark. And then, slowly, she began to see something, a faint light, shimmering in the distance. It flickered like a candle flame, weak and fragile, but it was there, cutting through the dark. Mia reached out, desperate to grasp it, and as she did, the light grew brighter, pulling her closer, until it enveloped her, blinding and white. When the light faded, she was standing in a room. It was small, cramped, with bare walls and a single old-fashioned mirror hanging above a wooden dresser. The mirror was cracked, a long, jagged line running through the glass, distorting her reflection. But it wasn't the room that made Mia's breath catch in her throat. It was the person standing beside her in the mirror. It was her. or at least it looked like her. The reflection was wearing the same clothes, had the same hair, the same eyes, but there was something wrong. The skin was too pale, the eyes too wide, too dark, and the lips were twisted into a crooked smile that made Mia's stomach turn. The reflection watched her, unblinking, and Mia felt a chill run down her spine. "You're not real," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're just a nightmare." The reflection's smile widened, and it tilted its head like a curious child. "Are you sure?" it asked, its voice soft and mocking. "After all, we're standing here together, aren't we?" Mia took a step back, shaking her head. "No, this isn't real. This can't be real." The reflection's eyes darkened, and it stepped closer, pressing its hands against the glass. "You're the one who made it real, Mia. You let us in. You brought us back." Mia's mind raced, trying to make sense of the reflection's words, but nothing was clear. She turned away from the mirror, only to find herself facing another one, identical to the first, with the same distorted reflection staring back at her. She spun around, but the room had changed. There were mirrors on every wall surrounding her, each one showing the same twisted image. The reflections began to move, stepping out of sync with her, their movements slow and deliberate. They raised their hands, pressing them against the glass, and as they did, the cracks in the mirrors began to spread, spiderwebbing across the surface until the glass was filled with fractures. "You've always been here, Mia," the reflection said, their voices merging into a single, echoing whisper. "You've just forgotten. But now, it's time to remember." Mia clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "Stop it," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't want to remember. I don't want any of this." The mirrors trembled, and the reflections began to shift, their features blurring and twisting, morphing into new shapes. Mia watched in horror as the faces changed. One moment they were her own, the next they were strangers, but familiar ones. She saw the receptionist, the woman from the mirror, the bus driver, and dozens of others, their faces flickering in and out, like images on a broken screen. They were all her. "Do you see it now?" the reflections whispered. "We are you. We've always been you." Mia stumbled back, her mind reeling. "No," she said, her voice cracking. "That's not possible." The room grew colder, and the mirrors darkened, the reflections fading, until only their eyes remained, glowing faintly in the shadows. "It's time to remember, Mia," they said, their voices soft, almost soothing. "It's time to see what you've been hiding from." The light in the room flickered, and Mia felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She closed her eyes, trying to steady herself, but when she opened them again, the room was gone. She was standing in a different place, one she recognized immediately, the lobby of the Raven's Rest. But it was different now. The chandelier was lit, casting a warm, golden light over the room. And there were people everywhere, talking, laughing, moving about, as if this were just another ordinary evening. Mia stood in the center of the lobby, watching as the scene unfolded around her. The guests were dressed in elegant, old-fashioned clothes, and she could hear the soft strains of music drifting in from a distant room, mingling with the chatter and laughter. It was like stepping back in time, to a world that no longer existed. She turned, and her breath caught in her throat. There, standing by the front desk, was a young woman. She was laughing, her eyes bright, and she was talking to a man in a dark suit. Mia's heart skipped a beat as she realized who the woman was. It was her. Or rather, it was someone who looked just like her, but younger, happier. She was dressed in a simple, elegant gown, her hair pinned up, and she had a look of joy on her face that Mia hadn't felt in years. Mia wanted to call out to her, to ask her who she was, but she couldn't find her voice. The scene played out like a dream, slipping through Mia's fingers, and she watched as the younger version of herself turned, smiling, and headed toward the staircase. The man in the suit watched her go, a strange, knowing smile on his lips, and Mia felt a chill run down her spine. She followed the woman, moving through the crowd, but no one seemed to notice her. It was as if she was invisible, a ghost drifting through the past. She climbed the stairs, her heart pounding, and as she reached the second floor, she saw the younger woman standing in front of a familiar door, room 207. Mia froze, her mind reeling, but she couldn't look away. She watched as the woman opened the door and stepped inside, closing it softly behind her. Mia followed, her hands trembling as she turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, empty room, and as she stepped inside, she felt the air grow colder, the shadows thickening around her. The room was empty, except for a single old mirror, leaning against the far wall. The glass was cracked, the same jagged line running through it, and Mia could see her reflection staring back at her, distorted and twisted. But there was someone else in the mirror, standing behind her, a dark figure with hollow eyes. Mia turned, but there was no one there. She looked back at the mirror, and the figure was still there, closer now, its dark, empty eyes fixed on hers. It reached out, its hand pressing against the glass, and Mia could see her own hand moving, mimicking the gesture. And then she realized it wasn't mimicking her. It was controlling her. The figure in the mirror smiled, and Mia felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She tried to pull away, but her hand wouldn't move. The figure stepped closer, its dark, hollow eyes filling the mirror, and she could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, pressing against her mind. "You can't escape, Mia," it whispered. "This is where you belong. This is where you've always been." The room spun, and Mia's vision blurred, the edges of the mirror darkening until all she could see was the figure, its eyes glowing in the dark. She could feel it reaching into her mind, pulling at the threads of her memories, unraveling them, and she realized, with a sickening sense of dread, that it was showing her something she had tried to forget. She was back in the hotel, but it wasn't the past. It was the present. The same cold, empty halls she'd been wandering. She was standing in the lobby, alone, and the room was silent, dark. And then, slowly, one by one, figures began to emerge from the shadows, their eyes glowing, their faces pale and hollow. They surrounded her, closing in, and she could see herself among them, her own face twisted into a mocking smile, her eyes dark and empty. They reached out, their hands cold and skeletal, and she felt them pulling her down, dragging her into the dark. "You're one of us, Mia," they whispered. "You've always been one of us. Welcome home." Mia tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the dark, and she felt herself slipping, falling, as the shadows closed in around her, suffocating, cold. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was her own reflection, smiling, its eyes wide and hollow as it whispered her name. Chapter 11. Beneath the Surface. Mia's eyes snapped open. She was lying on the floor of the hotel lobby, her body heavy and cold, her head pounding with a dull, throbbing pain. For a moment, she thought she had woken from a nightmare, but the shadows still clung to the walls, thick and dark, and the air was heavy with that familiar, suffocating chill. She tried to move, but her limbs felt like they were weighed down, as if something was pressing her against the floor. She could barely lift her head, her vision blurry, and as she struggled to focus, she saw them, figures, standing in a circle around her, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. They were watching her, silent and still, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Mia's breath hitched, and she forced herself to sit up, her muscles aching. What is this?" she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible. "What do you want?" One of the figures stepped forward, lowering its hood, and Mia's stomach twisted when she saw who it was. The woman from the mirror, her face pale, her eyes dark and empty, a faint, sad smile on her lips. She looked down at Mia, her expression almost tender, as if she were looking at a child who had lost her way. "You're still fighting it," the woman said softly. "Even now, you're still trying to escape." Mia shook her head, her hands trembling. "I don't belong here," she said, her voice cracking. I'm not one of you." The woman's smile faded, and she knelt down, reaching out to touch Mia's cheek. Her fingers were cold, but gentle, and Mia felt a shiver run through her. "You've been lost for so long, Mia," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "But it's time to come home. It's time to accept who you are." Mia felt tears sting her eyes, but she didn't understand why. She wanted to pull away, to run, but her body wouldn't move. "I'm not like you," she said, her voice trembling. I don't want this." The woman's eyes softened, and she leaned in closer, her breath cold against Mia's skin. "It doesn't matter what you want," she said, her tone gentle, almost soothing. "It never did. This is where you belong. This is where you've always been." Mia felt a wave of despair wash over her, and she closed her eyes, trying to block out the woman's voice, but it was no use. The shadows pressed in, cold and suffocating, and she could feel them creeping under her skin, burrowing deeper, filling her mind with a dark, creeping dread. When she opened her eyes again, the figures were gone, and she was alone in the lobby. The chandelier above was lit, casting a dim, yellow light over the room, and the grandfather clock ticked softly in the corner, its pendulum swinging back and forth. For a moment, everything seemed normal, as if nothing had happened, but she could still feel the cold weight pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Mia stood up slowly, her legs unsteady, and glanced around the lobby. It looked the same as it always had, but there was something off, something she couldn't quite place. The air felt different, heavier, and the shadows seemed to stretch a little longer, moving even when the light was still. She turned toward the front desk, and that's when she saw it. A small, black mirror, propped up against the wall, its surface smooth and dark, reflecting nothing. Mia's heart skipped a beat, and she felt a strange, magnetic pull, drawing her closer. She didn't want to look, didn't want to see, but her feet moved on their own, carrying her across the room. The mirror was small, no bigger than a hand, But when she looked into it, she saw not her own face, but the face of the woman from the mirror, staring back at her, her eyes wide and hollow, her lips curled into a sad, knowing smile. Mia recoiled, but the reflection didn't change. The woman in the mirror raised a hand, pressing it against the glass, and Mia felt a cold, sharp pain in her chest, as if something had pierced her heart. She gasped, clutching at her chest, but there was no wound, no blood, only the cold, suffocating pressure, growing stronger, tighter. The woman's lips moved, forming words, but no sound came out. Mia leaned closer, trying to read the silent message, and then she understood. "It's over, Mia. You're home." The glass rippled, like water disturbed by a pebble, and Mia felt a sharp, sudden pull, as if something had grabbed her from behind. She stumbled back, and the room around her blurred, twisting and warping. The walls melting into shadows, the light dimming until it was nothing but a faint, flickering glow. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the dark, and she felt herself falling, slipping through the shadows deeper and deeper until there was nothing but the cold, crushing blackness. She reached out, desperate to find something to hold on to, but there was nothing. Only the dark, endless and consuming. And then she felt it. A hand, cold and clammy, wrapping around her wrist, pulling her back, dragging her up through the dark. She gasped, choking on the cold air, and when she opened her eyes, she was back in the lobby, lying on the floor, the mirror still propped up against the wall. But something was different. The lobby was empty, silent, as if no one had been there for years. The furniture was covered in a thin layer of dust. The chandelier above was dark, and the clock had stopped, its pendulum hanging motionless. Mia stood up, her hands shaking, and looked around. But there was no sign of life, no sign of anyone. She glanced down at the mirror, and her breath caught in her throat. The reflection was gone, replaced by an empty, black void. But as she looked closer, she thought she saw something moving, something shifting in the darkness. She leaned in, squinting, and that's when she saw it, a face, her face, staring back at her, twisted and distorted, her eyes dark and empty. Mia stumbled back, her heart pounding, but the reflection didn't disappear. It watched her, unblinking, and then, slowly, it smiled, a cold, sinister smile that sent a chill down her spine. The mirror began to crack, the glass splintering, and Mia could feel the dark pressing in around her, suffocating, cold. She tried to turn away, but her feet wouldn't move, and she felt the shadows creeping up her legs, curling around her arms, pulling her closer to the mirror. The last thing she saw was her own reflection, smiling back at her, its eyes wide and hollow, as the glass shattered, splintering into 1,000 tiny shards. The room went dark, and she heard the faint, rhythmic tapping, slow and steady like a heartbeat, echoing through the silence. And then there was nothing. Days later, the Raven's Rest stood silent and empty, the once grand hotel, now a dark, abandoned shell. The locals of Hollow Creek spoke in hushed whispers, saying the hotel had always been cursed, a place where people went and never returned. But no one dared to enter, not anymore. They said they could still hear it sometimes late at night, the faint, rhythmic tapping, echoing from deep within the walls like a ghostly heartbeat, calling out to those who dared to listen. But no one ever did. And in the darkest corner of the empty lobby, buried beneath the dust and shadows, a small black mirror lay shattered on the floor, its surface cracked, reflecting nothing but the endless, empty dark. Welcome home, Mia. Thank you for joining us on this unsettling journey into the dark corners of the Raven's Rest. Here at Mumblebee, we craft tales that drift between the surreal and the unknown, leading you into the shadows and back, sometimes. We hope our story has chilled, thrilled, and maybe even lulled you to sleep as the whispers fade and the night deepens. If you enjoyed this tale, stay tuned for more haunting, hypnotic stories that carry you to the edges of dreams and nightmares. Until next time, sleep tight, and remember, some whispers are better left unheard. Sweet dreams from all of us at Mumblebee.